Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today, continuing with going through all of the books that were longlisted for the 2022 Booker Prize and knocking things off my desk. I am going to be talking about The Seven Moons of Maali, Almeida by Shehan, Karunatilaka. And this book, I think, was one of those ones that surprised quite a lot of people when it made the shortlist, predominantly because it was one that people hadn't heard of. It hadn't come out by that point, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about it. As with the other ones, I will be going into some spoilers at some point, and I'll sort of flag a bit before that comes, but the majority of this review should be relatively spoiler free, but do feel free to kind of cut out whenever you need to. But yeah, let's get started talking a little bit about this book. So let's start with the premise of this book itself. So the whole idea, and particularly this idea around the Seven Moons, is that our main character basically finds himself having died, and in a sort of, I think Eric Carl Anderson referred to it as almost being like the plot of Ghost, that sort of film, but essentially has to sort of go back and work out a little bit about how he died. And so essentially we watch him as he goes through 7 moons, so it's almost 7 days basically, of working out what happened to him. And in that time, he is in this sort of almost purgatory kind of style of place, where he is finding out what's happened. He's sort of able to talk to other people who have recently died. And he's sort of told quite early on about the various ramifications of finding out or not finding out what's happened. So, for example, if he gets to the end of the 7 moons and hasn't sort of got to a point where he's sort of happy with what is going to happen next, he has a few choices up his sleeve. He's either going to be sort of destroyed, or he can give up some of his potential power to, or potential powers or rights within this to be able to do other things, such as communicating with the living. And all of this is set against a backdrop of Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan politics. And as sort of, I don't know a great deal about the politics in that region. Last year, reading Anak Aripagasam's novel, which Passage North, which was also shortlisted for the Booker, I really loved finding out more about that history. But this book kind of goes around it and kind of gives some specific bits of information, but also withdraws and sort of withholds other bits. So we learn quite a lot early on about the various parties, political factions fighting against each other, how we're very much set up in a world where certain people very much fall under one camp or another, and there's a degree of distrust around a lot of that. And within that, we also start to slowly learn a little bit more about our protagonist, in that he was seen as quite, he was seen as a tricky figure because he was a photographer, and some of the pictures he took seemingly would have put, some people in, reputational damage, essentially. He had the power essentially to expose several people, which made him several enemies. And we learn that this may have something to do with his death. That comes up really early. Don't worry, that's not a major spoiler. But I think what's just so fascinating about this book and how it approaches it is just, I think, setting the whole book in the sort of post-death like land, almost this kind of magical space, really allows this book to go off on some kind of really interesting creative planes. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about this, is this book is able to kind of deal with the real, with the sort of realism of the political moment and the incredibly tricky things that are around that, but also deal with the fantastical. This book really hovers between those two planes in much the same way that the main character hovers between life and death in this way. And we are sort of given this really interesting purgatory space with which this whole thing is explored. And I found that really quite captivating and quite beautiful. I also wanted to pick up on the fact that this book is unapologetic in its queerness, in a way that I found really quite exciting and really interesting. So our main character, Maali, we find out is gay, but is somewhat closeted. And we hear his sort of bits about his relationships with others. Really early into the book, actually, it sort of goes into quite a lot of detail, not only about various types of sex that are being had, but also this very kind of like gay argot and kind of slang, this really kind of campy sort of bitchy put downs, and I just found it really funny. For a book that is so much about life and death, you wouldn't really think that there was a lot of humor to be gleaned from that, but actually I think one of this book's major triumphs is just how funny it is. It's absurd, it's ridiculous. There's a moment where there's a really sort of subtle, well, not even subtle, there's just a put down about a father saying something along the lines of, this man was very good at many things, being a father was not one of them. And he, as a kind of, as the storyteller, I think is just so interesting. The sort of focusing around this character is wonderful, just for this real humor that leaks out of every single page. Even during the darkest moments, we get little kind of put downs. We get somebody being, you know, sort of making a bawdy joke. We get someone kind of saying, haven't you been with enough men? Or, you know, like these sort of really silly little quips. And I think that's the thing I probably enjoyed most about this book, is just the way it does this in such a kind of knowing way. There's a real confidence to this author in writing like this. There's a sort of, he is in such control of the narrative that he is able to kind of introduce these little quips and just make it work really effectively. And I think that's just really beautiful and stunning about this book. Obviously it deals with politics as well, so there's a lot of heaviness there, but there's almost this kind of gallows humor of, you know, if you are existing, if you're not only dead, you know, which is an absurd thing, kind of to be dead but able to look out and understand everything that's going on around you and be uncovering your own death. There's also so much kind of absurdity in being able to look at the political situation in front of you and be like, well, there's nothing else to laugh about, we've got to find something. And I just really enjoyed this. I think overall as a book, before I go into some spoilers, I think overall I just sort of, as an overall view of this book, I just think it is so sumptuous and rich and beautiful. And it's also quite dense at times, which the middle passage of this book, I started getting a little bit lost just because I think it was quite heavy. It was the final book I read from the long list, and I think I was just tired. But I think there's something so beautiful about this. And again, without giving things away about the end part of the book, the last 60 pages of this I read in one chunk, almost breathlessly. It was some of the most incredible writing that came out. And I should say at this moment, there are a lot of this book is sort of done in a second person kind of narrative. A lot is sort of not, but there are moments where it pierces through and is done as you, blah, blah, blah. And part of that feels like the dead character Maali talking to himself and kind of acknowledging this almost split self that's there of, you know, the dead version and the living version. But part of it also is just so sort of probing to the reader, because we are really involved in this narrative and we are almost called out in various ways. And that last 60 pages, that whole section, I found so powerful, partly because of that you as well, because there is a real there's something just so fantastic. So before I end up accidentally spoiling that, I'm about to go into spoiler territory. But before I do, I just wanted to say, I think this is such a brilliant book. I see why it's on the long list. At the time of filming this, I don't know if it's been on the shortlist or not. This video will go out afterwards, so I may end up eating my words here. The more I think about this book, the more I think it will be on the shortlist, because I think it does very well with rereadings. Even if it doesn't make the shortlist, still a great book, and I think well worth checking out, and fantastic for this author to get that extra bit of love and exposure as well. But without further ado, before I ramble more, let's go on to some spoilers. So now we're in spoiler territory. I mentioned the last 60 pages being really highly effective for me and really sort of, I found really profound and really touching. And a key part of that, apart from just the language being gorgeous and sumptuous and really flowing, and this sort of really fast pace to it, was also just how it approaches themes around death. And particularly the thing I mentioned earlier about there being that special gift that he can have before he goes into the light. And that gift is to almost give up the idea of sort of, you know, having this sort of eternal life or having things go well, almost choosing the bad ending. And the things that he gives up in choosing that bad ending allow him the gift to be able to whisper to people in the real world. And this is the part where I think I found it really emotionally punchy and powerful, because we then have this character who has given up the chance to really seek his own form of justice in some ways, and instead finds a different kind, and that is to live on in some ways through others, but also to pass on knowledge to people in the living world. And although that doesn't sound like much, there's something, particularly because of that second person, there's something in there that is so touching at kind of going up to a loved one and whispering in their ear to let them know something. Obviously, this living person is just sort of like, hey, hang on, am I hallucinating? What's going on? I don't really know what this disembodied voice is all about. Maybe I should listen to it. Maybe I shouldn't. But actually, I found that really emotionally touching, because there is something about, you know, he's gone through this whole sort of journey after death, and to give up the good ending for himself in order to do this, to find another form of justice, to find whatever else, I thought was really beautiful. And particularly just that nuance of him floating through after having been quite a selfish person in some ways in his life, and deciding to be a little bit more selfless in others and pass on this knowledge. I just thought it was so beautiful. And yeah, I mean, you'll have to read it to kind of get into that final bit. And I think I know that a lot of people have found the density of this novel a bit much at times. I think especially that middle section can feel quite heavy. But actually, once you get into the rhythms of this book, I think that density is beautiful, because it's so, the language is so compacted, it's so crafted, that once you get into the rhythm, particularly of those final 60 pages for me, I think this is just a bit of a masterpiece, really. So yeah, that's me talking a bit about this book. I hope if you've read it, you've enjoyed it. I'd love to hear more people's thoughts. Take care, and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.